A cruel act transforms into a miracle when a wild horse rescues a blind puppy. A young veterinarian witnesses the impossible and decides to change both their destinies. Dark secrets, redemption, and unconditional love intertwine in this moving story. Prepare for a journey that will touch your heart. Subscribe, leave a like, and comment where you're watching from. A lesson in compassion you'll never forget. The sun was setting on the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and red, while shadows lengthened over the small town of Harmony Creek. A town of narrow streets and old houses, where everyone knew each other by name and guarded secrets as if they were treasures. On that autumn afternoon, a dark secret was about to be buried in the dark waters of Willow Creek Lake. A luxurious car, black as onyx, drove slowly down the dirt road that skirted the lake. Inside was Richard Thompson, owner of the largest stud farm in the region, a man whose power was measured not only by his fortune, but by the fear he inspired in others. His hands, wrinkled by time but still firm, held the steering wheel with determination. In the passenger seat, a small cardboard box moved subtly. The car stopped at an isolated spot, where the willow trees created a natural curtain, hiding it from curious eyes. Richard got out of the vehicle, adjusted his impeccable suit, and opened the passenger door. From the box, he took out a small puppy, trembling and fragile. Its eyes, two milky, lifeless spheres, spun disoriented, searching for a focus they would never find. A blind dog is useless, Richard muttered to himself, with a coldness that revealed decades of ruthless decisions. In my world, there's only room for perfection. With determined steps, he walked to the edge of the lake. For a brief moment, the puppy snuggled against his chest, seeking warmth and security. A slight tremor ran through Richard's hands, but it was quickly suppressed. Years of hardness had calloused his soul, just as the leather reins had calloused his palms. In a quick, precise movement, Richard threw the puppy into the dark waters of the lake. The small body fell with a muffled splash, while a sharp yelp cut through the afternoon silence. Concentric ripples formed on the water's surface, as if the lake itself shuddered at the act of cruelty. Richard Thompson remained motionless for a few seconds, watching the puppy struggle against the water. Then, without a backward glance, he returned to his car and drove away, leaving only a cloud of dust in the air and a small being fighting for life. But what Richard didn't know was that he wasn't alone that afternoon. On the hills surrounding the lake, among the golden fields of tall grass, a pair of attentive eyes watched. A wild horse, a magnificent white Andalusian whose coat was white as snow, had lived free in the lands around Harmony Creek for years. The horse, which locals called Spirit because of its ghostly appearances at dusk, raised its head, its nostrils flaring as it smelled fear. Its ears twitched towards the desperate yelps coming from the lake. Something awakened within that noble animal, something primitive and powerful that transcended the limits of instinct. In a movement that defied the logic of the natural world, Spirit galloped down the hill in a headlong rush, its white mane floating in the air like a war banner. Its hooves struck the ground with force, kicking up dirt and grass as the animal headed for the lake with an almost human determination. Without hesitation, the magnificent equine plunged into the cold water. It swam with elegance and strength until it reached the small puppy, which was already beginning to sink. With impressive delicacy, it took the little dog by the scruff of the neck with its teeth and began swimming back to shore. At the same time this extraordinary scene unfolded, another witness arrived at the location. Sarah Miller, a recent veterinary graduate, had moved to Harmony Creek just 3 weeks prior to take a position at the town's only veterinary clinic. That afternoon, she had decided to explore the surroundings, following residents' directions about the beauty of Willow Creek Lake at sunset. Sarah parked her old pickup truck and was reaching for her camera when she saw the impossible happen. Before her eyes, a wild horse rescuing a puppy from the lake's waters. For a moment, she thought she was dreaming or having some kind of hallucination. She blinked several times, but the scene remained there, real and stunning. "Oh my God," she exclaimed, dropping the camera onto the car seat and running towards the lake. The horse had already reached the shore and, carefully, placed the soaked puppy onto the grass. Sarah approached slowly, aware that she was facing a wild animal. The horse raised its head, its dark eyes meeting hers. There was no fear in that gaze, only a primitive intensity that made Sarah stop, respecting the distance. "Easy there, friend," she said, using the soft voice she used to calm animals at the clinic. "I'm here to help." Spirit snorted, its nostrils flaring. It took a step back but didn't flee. It seemed to be assessing the approaching woman's intentions. Sarah took the opportunity to kneel down and examine the puppy. It was a small mixed breed, with caramel and white fur, soaked and trembling violently. She immediately realized the animal was blind. Who would do something like this? She murmured to herself, feeling a wave of indignation course through her body. With slow, precise movements, Sarah took off her jacket and wrapped the puppy, trying to warm it. The little animal whimpered softly, still in shock from the trauma. As she held it against her chest, Sarah looked again at the wild horse, which remained there, vigilant. "You're a hero, you know," she said, even though she knew the animal didn't understand her words. "I've never seen anything like it in my life." It was at that moment that Sarah made a decision that would forever change the course of her life. She would not only save that blind puppy, but also find a way to protect that extraordinary wild horse. Something told her that the destinies of the three of them, hers, the puppies, and the horses, were now intertwined by that improbable act of rescue. "I promise I'll take care of him," she said to the horse, as if making a solemn pact. "And I'll also find a way to protect you." The horse neighed softly, as if it understood, before turning and beginning to climb the hill. Sarah watched, fascinated, as the majestic animal disappeared among the tall fields, its white silhouette gradually merging with the orange sky of dusk. With the puppy safe in her arms, Sarah returned to her pickup truck. As she drove back to town, her mind swirled with questions. Who had thrown that defenseless puppy into the lake? Why would a wild horse risk itself to save a dog? And how would she, a newcomer in such a closed and traditional town, manage to unravel these mysteries? What Sarah didn't know was that her search for answers would lead her to confront the most deeply rooted power structures of Harmony Creek, putting her on a collision course with Richard Thompson, whose roots in the town were as deep as his influence. That night, while caring for the puppy in her small apartment above the veterinary clinic, Sarah couldn't forget the image of the white horse emerging from the water with the puppy between its teeth. It was like a scene from another world, something that defied logic and reason, something that somehow seemed to have a greater purpose. "I'll call you Miracle," she whispered to the puppy that slept, curled up in a blanket on her bed. "Because that's what you are, a little miracle." In its restless sleep, the puppy shivered as if dreaming of dark, cold waters. Sarah placed her hand on its fragile little body, silently promising that it would never again feel fear or loneliness. From that moment on, she would be its protector, its eyes in the world, its guide in the darkness. Outside, the full moon illuminated the distant hills where a white horse watched the town, like a silent guardian, a protective spirit whose purpose was just beginning to reveal itself. The following days were filled with intense work for Sarah. During the day, she attended to the region's animals at the clinic, slowly gaining the trust of the local farmers, who were always suspicious of outsiders, especially young women in positions traditionally held by men. At night, she dedicated herself entirely to Miracle, the blind puppy struggling to recover. It was delicate work. The puppy not only needed to recover from the physical trauma, but also to learn to trust. Sarah developed special exercises to help him orient himself without sight, using different sounds and textures to create a mental map of the environment. "You are much more capable than you imagine," she would say, as she guided the puppy through the small apartment, letting him explore every corner, every texture, every smell. "Darkness doesn't define your limits, little Miracle." Over the weeks, Miracle gained strength and confidence. His other senses sharpened, compensating for the lack of vision. His sense of smell became increasingly refined, allowing him to identify people and other animals at a distance. His hearing picked up the subtlest sounds, from rustling leaves to a racing heartbeat. And most surprisingly, He developed an extraordinary sensitivity to vibrations in the ground, anticipating the approach of people or large animals. While Miracle recovered, Sarah didn't forget the other protagonist of that extraordinary story. On weekends, she drove to the hills around the lake, searching for the wild horse that had performed the impossible. She brought carrots and apples, leaving them strategically in places where she noticed signs of the animal's presence. It was on one of these expeditions, almost a month after the rescue, that Sarah finally found Spirit again. She was sitting on a rock, watching the lake in the distance, when she felt a presence behind her. She turned slowly, and there he was, a few yards away, majestic in his wild freedom. "Hello, friend," she said softly, remaining still so as not to scare him. "I came to thank you again for what you did." The horse watched her with its deep, dark eyes, as if evaluating her soul. Sarah held out her hand, offering an apple she had brought in her pocket. To her surprise, after a few moments of hesitation, the horse approached. With delicacy, it took the fruit from her hand, its velvety lips brushing her fingers in a touch as soft as a feather. It was a moment of pure connection, an invisible bridge forming between two such different beings, united by an act of compassion that defied nature. Sarah felt silent tears stream down her face, moved by the beauty of that encounter. "He's doing well, you know," she told Spirit, as if talking to an old friend. "He's growing strong, learning to get by without seeing. He's a fighter, just like you." The horse remained there, allowing Sarah to speak, as if it understood every word. When she finally fell silent, it approached a little closer and, in a gesture that left her breathless, nudged its muzzle against her shoulder, a touch as light as it was significant. Then, as silently as it had arrived, Spirit moved away, disappearing among the trees that dotted the hillside. Sarah sat there for a long time, feeling she had been blessed with a moment of pure magic, one of those that happen only once in a lifetime and are never forgotten. As she returned to town, Sarah didn't know she was being watched. From a distance, using hunting binoculars, Richard Thompson followed her with interest. The old rancher had noticed the young veterinarian's constant presence on the lands near the lake, lands that, although not officially his, he considered part of his domain. "Who is that young woman, Johnson?" he asked the foreman who accompanied him. "She's the new vet at Dr. Roberts' clinic, boss. Sarah Miller, recently graduated, arrived just over a month ago." Richard frowned, watching the young woman get into her worn pickup truck. "And what is she doing around here so much alone?" "They say she's looking for a wild horse, sir, a white animal that's been seen in the hills." Richard's eyes shone with sudden interest. For years he had heard stories about a majestic white horse that lived free in the hills, but he had always considered them local legends, exaggerated tales from ranch hands and hunters. Now, the possibility that the animal truly existed ignited an old ambition within him. "A wild Andalusian," he murmured, more to himself than to the foreman. "It would be an extraordinary addition to my stud farm." "Do you want me to send the men to capture the animal?" Johnson asked. Richard thought for a moment, his eyes still fixed on the pickup truck that was now driving away down the dirt road. "No, not yet. First, I want to know more about this young woman and what she's found out. Schedule an appointment for my pointer at her clinic tomorrow." "Yes, sir." As the sun set, painting the sky red, Richard Thompson felt a growing unease. Something about that young woman's determination bothered him, like a distant omen of trouble. What if somehow she had witnessed his act that evening by the lake? The thought made him swallow hard, his throat suddenly dry. "Let's go, Johnson. It's getting late." As his Jeep drove back to the stud farm, Richard couldn't shake the thought that perhaps he had made a mistake, not about the act itself. In his mind, getting rid of a defective animal was just a practical matter, but about being careless enough to be potentially observed. "I need to be more careful," he thought, as the lights of his mansion began to appear on the horizon. Much more careful. The next morning, the Harmony Creek Veterinary Clinic was particularly busy. It was vaccination day for the cattle on the Smith's farm, and Dr. Robert, the clinic owner and senior veterinarian, had left early to answer the call, leaving Sarah in charge of the town appointments. She had just finished an appointment with a goat that was suffering from digestive problems when the reception door opened. Sarah felt an involuntary shiver as she saw Richard Thompson enter, holding the leash of an imposing English pointer. "Good morning," he said, with a studied cordiality. "You must be Dr. Miller. I've heard good things about your work." Sarah forced a smile, trying to hide her discomfort. Even without ever having met him personally, she knew exactly who Richard Thompson was. His reputation preceded him. A ruthless businessman, owner of the largest lands in the region, and one of the country's most prestigious stud farms. A man who, according to rumors, did not take kindly to being crossed. "Thank you, Mr. Thompson. How can I help you?" "My Duke here," he said, indicating the pointer, "has a slight limp in his front right paw. Nothing serious, but I prefer not to risk it. He's been my hunting companion for years." Sarah nodded, gesturing for him to follow her to the exam room. As she walked, she felt Richard's eyes fixed on her back, evaluating her, as if searching for something specific. In the exam room, Sarah knelt to examine the dog's paw. Duke was a magnificent animal, with well-defined muscles under his short, glossy coat and lively, intelligent eyes. A dog clearly well cared for and trained. "How long has he been limping?" she asked, keeping her voice professional. "I noticed it yesterday during our walk on the property." As she examined the animal, Sarah sensed that the casual conversation was just a facade. There was a tension in the air, an unspoken expectation. It was then that Richard finally revealed the true purpose of his visit. "They say you've been looking for a wild horse in the hills," he commented with false casualness. "A white animal, of exceptional stature." Sarah felt her heart race but maintained a neutral expression, focused on the dog's examination. "Yes, I have seen an extraordinary animal out there, a rare specimen. You know, I have a stud farm with some of the best horses in the country. A wild Andalusian would be an interesting addition." Sarah finally looked up, meeting Richard's penetrating gaze. "I presume for breeding?" "Among other things," he replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'd be willing to pay a good reward to anyone who helped me capture it." It was an offer, Sarah realized, wrapped in a thin layer of casualness. A business proposition disguised as small talk. "I think that animal deserves to remain free, Mr. Thompson," she replied, keeping her voice firm despite her growing nervousness. "Not everything in nature exists to serve us." Richard's smile disappeared, replaced by a harsh, almost threatening expression. "Freedom is a romantic concept, Doctor. In practice, every living being serves a greater purpose. The question is just what that purpose will be." Sarah finished the examination in silence, feeling the weight of Richard's gaze. She found only a slight inflammation in the pointer's paw, easily treatable with an anti-inflammatory and a few days of rest. "Nothing serious," she concluded, standing up and maintaining a safe distance. "I'll prescribe medication and recommend he rest for 3 days. No strenuous activity." Richard nodded, his face an impenetrable mask. While Sarah wrote the prescription, he wandered around the room, observing the equipment, the photos on the walls, absorbing every detail. "I heard you recently adopted a puppy," he commented suddenly. "A blind mixed breed, isn't that right?" The pencil in Sarah's hand froze mid-word. How did he know? She hadn't talked about Miracle with hardly anyone in town, except Dr. Robert and his wife. "News travels fast in Harmony Creek," Richard continued in response to her silence. "Small towns, you know how it is. Everyone knows everything." Sarah completed the prescription with hands that now trembled slightly and handed it to Richard, along with a bottle of pills. 2 pills a day for 5 days. If the limping persists, bring him back. Richard took the prescription and the medication, his fingers brushing hers deliberately. Then he took his wallet from his pocket and extended several bills, much more than the cost of the consultation. "Keep the change," he said with a cold smile. "Consider it an incentive to reconsider my offer about the horse." Before Sarah could reply, he was already at the door, the pointer by his side. "Oh, and doctor," he added, turning one last time, "be careful in the hills. It's easy to get lost out there, especially for someone who doesn't know the terrain." It would be a shame if something happened to the only young veterinarian in town. The threat was there, barely disguised under a thin layer of concern. Sarah swallowed hard but maintained an upright posture, chin held high. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Thompson, but I can take care of myself." When the door finally closed behind him, Sarah let out the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her legs felt weak, and she had to lean on the exam table to keep from falling. That encounter had confirmed her suspicions. Richard Thompson was not only a powerful and unscrupulous man, but also, possibly, the one responsible for throwing Miracle into the lake. That night, upon returning to her apartment, Sarah found Miracle, waiting for her anxiously at the door. Despite not being able to see, the puppy always seemed to know exactly when she was arriving, perhaps from the familiar sound of her footsteps on the stairs or the scent he had learned to recognize. "Hi, little one," she said, picking him up and receiving enthusiastic licks in response. "You won't believe the day I had." As she prepared dinner for herself and the puppy, who now ate special kibble mixed with cooked vegetables, Sarah reflected on the meeting with Richard. The veiled threat, the interest in the horse, the knowledge about Miracle. Everything indicated that she had, unintentionally, put herself on a collision course with the town's most powerful man. The phone rang, pulling her from her thoughts. It was Dr. Robert, her boss, wanting to know how the day at the clinic had been. "Everything was quiet, just routine appointments," she replied, deciding not to mention Richard's visit. She didn't want to cause unnecessary worry to the kind veteran who had given her an opportunity when many others had closed their doors. "And I also had a visit from Mr. Thompson with his pointer," she added, trying to sound casual. "Nothing serious, just a slight inflammation in the paw." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. "Richard Thompson came to the clinic personally?" Dr. Robert finally asked, with a note of surprise in his voice. "That's unusual. He usually sends his staff for that sort of thing." "He seemed interested in talking about horses," Sarah replied, choosing her words carefully. "Specifically, about a wild horse they say lives in the hills." Another silence, longer this time. "Sarah," Dr. Roberts' voice was now filled with concern. "Be careful with Richard Thompson. He's not the type of man who takes no for an answer. If he's interested in that horse, it's best to stay away from the subject." "But Dr. Robert, this horse is special. Sarah," the veteran interrupted with unusual firmness. "Harmony Creek may seem like just a quiet little town, but it has its own rules, its own power hierarchies. Richard Thompson has been at the top of that hierarchy longer than you and I have been alive. He's not someone you want to make an enemy of." Sarah felt a pang of frustration. She wanted to tell Dr. Robert what she had witnessed at the lake, how the horse had saved Miracle, how she suspected Richard was responsible for the cruelty against the puppy. But something stopped her, a feeling that, perhaps even the kind, Dr. Robert might be under the influence of Thompson's power. "I understand," she finally said. "I'll be careful." After hanging up, Sarah sat on the small sofa with Miracle nestled in her lap. Her mind was buzzing with thoughts, plans, and fears. It was clear she couldn't count on many allies in her mission to protect the wild horse. Harmony Creek was Richard Thompson's territory, and few people would be willing to oppose him. "We're alone in this, Miracle," she whispered to the puppy, who lifted his head, as if he understood the gravity of the situation. "But that doesn't mean we're going to give up." That night, Sarah slept poorly, tormented by dreams of white horses galloping under the moon, pursued by threatening shadows. In one dream, she was in the lake, sinking into the dark waters, while a figure watched impassively from the shore. When she woke up, bathed in cold sweat, she knew what she needed to do. If she wanted to protect Spirit and unravel Richard Thompson's secrets, she would need concrete proof of his actions. And for that, she would need to take even greater risks. The following days passed in a seemingly normal routine. Sarah continued attending to the animals at the clinic, slowly earning the trust of the local residents with her dedication and knowledge. In the late afternoons, she took Miracle for short walks in the clinic's yard, helping him strengthen his muscles and develop confidence in his other senses. What no one knew was that, on these occasions, she also trained the puppy To recognize specific scents, she used pieces of fabric with Spirit's odor, obtained from the apples and carrots the horse bit, and taught Miracle to identify that particular smell. "That's right. Find Spirit," she encouraged, as the increasingly confident puppy sniffed the air and followed the invisible trail to the piece of fabric hidden in the garden. Sarah knew that, if her plan worked, Miracle would be a crucial ally. A blind dog, more than any other, relied entirely on its sense of smell, and this heightened sense could be the key to finding the wild horse when needed. On weekends, she continued her excursions to the hills, but now she was more careful. She varied the times, used different paths, always vigilant for any sign of being watched. On some of these trips, she took Miracle with her, allowing the puppy to become familiar with the sense of nature, and especially with Spirit's unique smell. It was during one of these excursions, almost 2 months after the incident at the lake, that something extraordinary happened. Sarah had found a small hidden valley among the hills, a place difficult to access for those who didn't know the terrain. She had let Miracle explore the area while she photographed some medicinal plants for her personal catalog. Suddenly, she realized the puppy had disappeared. With a racing heart, she began calling him, fearing he had gotten lost or, worse, fallen into a ravine. "Miracle, Miracle, where are you?" A distant bark answered her call. Sarah followed the sound, pushing her way through dense bushes until she reached a small clearing. There, the scene she found made her heart almost stop. Miracle was sitting, his tail wagging furiously, in front of Spirit. The majestic white horse was lowered, its head almost level with the small dog, and the two seemed engaged in some kind of silent communication. The horse's muzzle gently touched the puppy's head, which responded with enthusiastic licks. "Unbelievable," Sarah murmured, frozen in place, afraid to break the spell of that moment. It was as if the two recognized each other, as if the connection, forged on that tragic day by the lake, had created a bond that defied logic. The savior and the saved reunited again, not by chance but by a kind of inexplicable magnetism. Slowly, so as not to scare them, Sarah approached. Spirit raised its head, its eyes meeting hers. There was no fear or distrust in that look, only recognition and, Sarah could almost swear, a kind of silent communication. "You remember each other," she said, amazed. "After all this time." Miracle, sensing her approach, ran towards her, barking happily as if wanting to tell her about his encounter. Sarah picked him up, laughing at the puppy's excitement, before turning her attention back to the horse. "And you, my friend, continue to surprise us," she said softly to Spirit. The horse approached, without the hesitation of the first times. Now there was a familiarity between them, like old acquaintances reuniting after a long separation. Sarah extended her hand and Spirit nudged its muzzle against it, a gesture of trust that deeply moved her. It was at that moment, with the puppy in her arms and the wild horse before her, that Sarah had an idea. A risky, possibly dangerous idea, but one that could be the key to protecting Spirit from Richard Thompson. The annual horse festival of Harmony Creek was approaching. It was the town's most important event, attracting visitors from across the region. Richard Thompson was, as always, the main sponsor, and his purebred horses were the great stars of the competitions. What if she, Sarah, could present Spirit and Miracle together, showing the entire community the extraordinary bond between them? If people witnessed that unique connection, it would be much harder for Richard to capture the horse without facing public disapproval. "What do you two think?" she asked, looking from the puppy to the horse. "Ready to become local celebrities?" Miracle barked, as if approving the idea. Spirit just watched her with those deep, wise eyes, as if weighing the consequences. Then, in a gesture that Sarah interpreted as agreement, the horse lowered its head in a kind of bow. The plan was formed. In the following days, Sarah began working secretly with Spirit and Miracle, establishing a routine of meetings in the hidden valley. It was fascinating to observe how the wild horse, which had never been tamed, seemed to instinctively understand what she wanted. Miracle, in turn, developed in a surprising way. Despite his blindness, he quickly learned to orient himself by the sound of Spirit's hooves, creating a natural and fluid choreography. The puppy, now almost 4 months old, had grown strong and confident, transforming what many would see as a disability into a strength. "You are extraordinary," Sarah would say, watching the two interact. "Together, you are capable of things no one would imagine possible." As the festival approached, preparations in town intensified. Colorful banners were hung on the streets, stages set up in the central square, temporary stables built to house visiting horses. Richard Thompson's stud farm buzzed with activity, his employees polishing every last detail of the equipment, training the competition horses intensively. Sarah kept her plan a secret, confessing only to Dr. Robert that she would like to do a small presentation at the festival, a demonstration on how animals with disabilities can adapt and overcome their limitations, she explained, without going into detail about Spirit or the true purpose of the presentation. Dr. Robert, always supportive of educational initiatives, managed to include her in the official program in a small slot between the main competitions. In tour. The week leading up to the festival, Sarah intensified training with Miracle and Spirit. It was incredible how the wild horse, which had never been ridden, allowed her to climb onto its back without a saddle or bridle. An almost telepathic communication had been established between them, based on mutual trust and respect. "I've never seen anything like it," she commented to herself, as she guided Spirit only with light touches of her legs and whispered words. "It's as if he understands every word, every intention." The day of the festival finally arrived, with a clear blue sky that seemed to bless the event. The entire town was out on the streets, dressed in their best clothes, creating a colorful mosaic of anticipation and celebration. Stalls selling local food, crafts, and games spread across the central square, while on the carefully prepared arena, the first riders were already warming up for the competitions. Sarah had planned everything with meticulous care. Miracle was hidden in a small adapted box in her pickup truck, while Spirit waited in the valley, a few miles away. The plan was simple. When it was her turn to present, Sarah would take Miracle to the center of the arena. The puppy, trained to find Spirit by scent, would bark in a specific direction. Then, as if answering the call, the majestic white horse would appear, creating a moment of pure magic before the entire town. While waiting for her turn, Sarah watched the competitions with polite interest, although her mind was miles away, rehearsing every detail of the plan. Richard Thompson's horses' presentations were, as always, impressive. Animals of impeccable pedigree, trained with military rigor, performing complex maneuvers that drew enthusiastic applause from the audience. Richard himself watched from his special box, a glass of wine in hand, a satisfied smile on his tanned face. Occasionally, his gaze met Sarah's in the crowd, and a cold, almost threatening glint momentarily replaced his cordial expression. Finally, after the main event's awards ceremony, the announcer called Sarah to the center of the arena. "And now, ladies and gentlemen, a special presentation by our young veterinarian, Dr. Sarah Miller, on animals with special needs and their incredible ability to adapt." There was polite applause, though less enthusiastic than for the competitions. Sarah walked to the center of the arena, leading Miracle on a leash. The puppy, now a medium-sized young dog, walked confidently beside her, head held high, ears attentive to the sounds around him. "Good afternoon, everyone," Sarah began, her voice amplified by the lapel microphone she had put on. "Today, I want to share with you an extraordinary story, a story about courage, compassion, and the incredible ability of animals to overcome their limitations." As she spoke, she noticed Richard lean forward in his seat, suddenly more attentive. His foreman, Johnson, whispered something in his ear, and the rancher's expression became serious, almost worried. "This is Miracle," Sarah continued, indicating the dog beside her. "He has been blind since birth. A few months ago, he was abandoned to his fate, thrown into the waters of Willow Creek Lake by someone who considered him worthless because of his disability." A murmur ran through the audience. Abandoning animals wasn't uncommon in the region, but the cruelty of throwing a blind puppy into a lake shocked even the most insensitive. Miracle should have died that day, but something extraordinary happened. something that defies logic and reason. Sarah paused dramatically, feeling everyone's eyes fixed on her and the dog. It was the crucial moment. Miracle was saved by an unlikely hero, a being who, by all laws of nature, should ignore the fate of a dog, a being who chose compassion over instinct. With a subtle gesture, Sarah released Miracle's leash and whispered the command they had practiced so many times. "Find Spirit, Miracle. Find our friend." The dog immediately raised his muzzle, sniffing the air intently. Then, to the audience's surprise, he began barking towards the distant hills, calling, summoning. For a few seconds, nothing happened. The audience waited in confused silence, not understanding the purpose of the demonstration. Sarah felt a cold knot in her stomach. What if Spirit didn't come? What if her whole plan failed before hundreds of witnesses? It was then that a powerful neigh cut through the silence. All eyes turned in the direction of the sound, and there he was on top of the nearest hill, his white coat shining in the sun as if made of pure light. Spirit, the wild horse, answering the call. A collective gasp swept through the crowd. The horse remained on the hilltop for a few seconds, like an apparition from another world, before beginning to descend the hill in a powerful, majestic gallop. Sarah felt tears in her eyes, moved by the sight of that extraordinary animal. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Richard Thompson abruptly rise from his box, his face a mask of astonishment and greed. Spirit reached the arena and headed directly for EI. Miracle, who was wagging his tail frantically, recognizing the sound and scent of his savior. The horse lowered its head, touching the dog's head with its muzzle in a gesture of recognition that drew a collective "oh" from the audience. "It was this horse," Sarah announced, her voice thick with emotion. "This magnificent wild animal who saved Miracle on that fateful day. He plunged into the lake, rescued the puppy from the waters, and brought him back to life." The crowd was in absolute silence, mesmerized by the extraordinary scene unfolding before their eyes. A wild horse and a blind dog, connected by a bond that transcended species barriers. "Since then," Sarah continued, "these two unlikely beings have developed a friendship that teaches us about compassion, loyalty, and the ability to overcome limitations. Miracle, despite his blindness, found a guide and protector in Spirit. And Spirit, an animal that has never known the human yoke, found a companion and friend in little Miracle." As she spoke, Sarah observed the reactions in the audience. Faces were moved, some with tears in their eyes, others with smiles of pure admiration. Children pointed, enchanted by the interaction between the two animals. It was at that moment that Sarah realized her plan had worked. There was something almost sacred about the scene she presented, something that touched the hearts of even the hardest people. Something that would make it very difficult for Richard Thompson to capture Spirit without facing public condemnation. She extended her hand to the horse, which approached gently, allowing her to touch its neck. With a fluid movement, Sarah climbed onto its back without a saddle or harness, simply trusting the bond they had developed. Miracle, following the sound of the movements, positioned himself beside the horse. "I'd like to show you," Sarah said, "how these two unlikely friends have created their own language, their own way of communicating." In the following minutes, Sarah, Spirit, and Miracle performed a series of coordinated movements they had practiced in the hidden valley. The horse galloped in circles while the dog, guided by the sound of the hooves, followed the same pattern in the center. At certain moments, Spirit would stop, and Miracle, sensing the absence of sound, would also stop his movement, creating a synchronized dance that seemed rehearsed for years. The audience applauded at each new maneuver, truly enchanted by the interspecies spectacle they were witnessing. Even the most experienced competitors watched with admiration the ability of that wild horse to perform complex movements without any formal training. Sarah concluded the presentation by positioning Spirit in the center of the arena, with Miracle sitting between his front legs, an image of protection and affection that summarized the entire essence of their story. "This is proof," she said, her voice now firm and clear, "that the value of a living being is not measured by its usefulness or perfection, but by its capacity to love and connect." Miracle and Spirit teach us that limitations are more in our eyes than in reality, and that true greatness lies in extending a hand, or a paw, to help those in need, even when there is nothing to gain. The applause was deafening. People rose from their seats, giving a standing ovation to the unusual presentation that had touched their hearts, in a way no technical equestrian display ever could. When Sarah finally led Spirit and Miracle out of the arena, she was approached by dozens of people who wanted to touch the animals, ask questions, express their admiration. Children asked to pet Miracle. Elderly people looked with reverence at Spirit, as if they were before a living legend. From his box, Richard Thompson watched the scene with an inscrutable expression. His plan to capture the wild horse had just become much more complicated. Now, Spirit was no longer just a wild animal in the hills. He was a hero, a symbol, a story that would be told and retold in Harmony Creek for generations. And Sarah, the young veterinarian everyone considered just a temporary outsider, had just established herself as a force to be reckoned with in town. A force that, for the first time in decades, openly challenged Richard Thompson's absolute dominance. The silent battle between the two had just begun, and on that sunny festival day, the first round clearly belonged to Sarah. As she led Spirit back to the hills, with Miracle trotting happily by her side, Sarah felt a deep sense of accomplishment. Something had changed that day, not just for her but for all of Harmony Creek. A seed of transformation had been planted, a seed that would grow into a tree of change, compassion, and respect for all forms of life. On the horizon, dark clouds were beginning to form, foreshadowing a storm. But Sarah was not afraid. She had faced her first great challenge and emerged victorious. Whatever came next, she would face it with the same courage and determination. With one last look at the town that now buzzed with stories about the wild horse and the blind dog, Sarah smiled. The journey was just beginning.